I remember the cockpit feeling smaller than usual that morning, the oxygen mask pressing against my face with a weight I couldn't shake. They tell you in flight school that the sky is neutral, but over the Persian Gulf, the air felt thick with a quiet, jagged electricity. I was thousands of feet above the water, tracing the edge of a line I wasn't supposed to cross, when the radar warning receiver started screaming. It wasn't a glitch, it was a lock. Within seconds, the horizon erupted, and my wingman, the man I'd shared breakfast with just 3 hours prior, simply vanished into a cloud of fire and debris. I saw his parachute deploy, a tiny white speck falling into the heart of hostile territory. And in that moment, the mission changed from a routine patrol to a desperate race against a clock I couldn't see. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was the beginning of a nightmare that the world was never supposed to hear about. The descent was a blur of G-forces and adrenaline. As I banked my jet to track the canopy's path, my sensors confirmed the worst. Iranian patrol boats were already pivoting, their wakes cutting white scars across the dark blue water toward the splash point. I was low on fuel, Winchester on heavy ordnance, and officially, I didn't have permission to engage. But looking down at that lone pilot bobbing in the waves, I knew that if I followed the rules of engagement, he'd be a prisoner of war before the sun hit its peak. I had to make a choice that would either save my brother or start a global conflict, all while the Iranian shore batteries were waking up and painting my jet with lethal intent. I leveled the wings, ignored the bingo fuel light flashing on my HUD, and dived toward the surface, praying that my engines would scream louder than the fear in my chest. The salt spray was visible even from my altitude, a mist hanging over the crash site like a shroud. My radio crackled with the frantic, distorted voice of my wingman, Miller, coming through the emergency guard channel. He was alive, but he was panicked. He told me he could hear the engines of the Iranian fast attack boats closing in. From my cockpit, I could see them, 3 high-speed vessels kicking up massive plumes of spray less than 2 miles from his position. I looked at my fuel gauge again. I was down to a few minutes of playtime before I'd be forced to ditch in the ocean myself. Command was over the long-range link, their voices calm and clinical, ordering me to RTB, return to base. They said a search and rescue SAR team was spinning up, but I knew the math. The SAR birds were 40 minutes out. Miller had 5. I made the call to ignore the overhead commands. I dipped the nose of my F-18, the airframe groaning as I pushed it past the structural limits of the current configuration. I wasn't going to fire a missile. That would be an act of war. But I could use the jet itself as a psychological weapon. I roared past the lead Iranian boat at 500 knots, barely 50 feet above the masts. The wake from my engines nearly capsized the nearest vessel, forcing them to veer off. For a second, I thought I'd bought him enough time. But then my cockpit lit up like a Christmas tree. The shore-based surface-to-air missile sights had finally synchronized. A solid, high-pitched tone filled my helmet, the sound of a heat seeker leaving the rail. I pulled hard into a vertical climb, punching flares and watching the missile's white streak pass so close I could feel the concussive thump of its proximity fuse. The game had just changed. They weren't just trying to capture Miller anymore. They were trying to kill us both. The sky was no longer my sanctuary. It had become a kill zone. Every time I banked to keep eyes on Miller, the RWR, radar warning receiver, shrieked, a digital reminder that a dozen eyes were tracking my every move from the coast. I was dancing on a razor's edge, burning through my remaining fuel just to stay vertical and difficult to hit. Below me, the Iranian boats had recovered from my low-level pass. They were regrouping, more cautious now, but more determined. They knew I was a lone wolf with a dwindling clock. I could see Miller struggling with his life raft, the bright orange fabric a bullseye against the deep turquoise of the Gulf. He looked so small, a speck of humanity caught in the gears of a geopolitical machine that was ready to grind him down. Then came the voice I had been dreading. It wasn't command, and it wasn't Miller. It was a heavy, accented English breaking over the open distress frequency. American pilot, you are in our territorial waters. Cease your maneuvers or you will be destroyed. The man in the water is now a guest of the Islamic Republic. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just talking to me. They were recording this for the world to see. If I stayed, I'd be the spark that ignited a regional war. If I left, Miller would be paraded on a screen in Tehran by morning. I looked at my fuel. 300 pounds, not enough to get back to the carrier. I was officially committed. I keyed my mic, my voice steadier than I felt, and told the ghost on the radio exactly what would happen if they touched that raft. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was a shield made of titanium and desperate intent. The silence that followed my threat was the heaviest part of the entire ordeal. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. I was gliding on fumes, my engines whining in a lower, more desperate pitch, while the Iranian vessels sat dead in the water, weighing their options. I could see the sailors on deck, shadows against the gray hull, looking up at me. We were locked in a standoff that felt like it lasted a lifetime. Two nations staring at each other through the eyes of a starving jet and a few terrified men in a boat. Miller was still there, frozen in his raft, his gaze fixed on my wings as if his entire soul was tethered to the metal of my aircraft. Suddenly, the radar screen blossomed with new contacts. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was it a second wave of Iranian interceptors? I braced for the end, ready to take as many as I could with me. But then the distinct rhythmic thumping of heavy rotors broke through the static of my headset. Guardian 1-1, this is Rescue 6. We have your visual. Clear the lane. Two Blackhawks, flanked by a pair of Cobras, came screaming across the horizon, flying so low they were kicking up a permanent mist from the sea. They hadn't waited for the 40-minute window. They had pushed their airframes to the breaking point to get to us. The Iranian boats saw the incoming firepower and realized the window for a quiet capture had slammed shut. They turned hard, their engines churning the water into a frantic white foam as they retreated toward the safety of the coastline. I watched them go, a wave of relief so violent it made my hands shake on the stick. Miller was going home. But as I turned my nose toward the carrier, the fuel-critical warning finally turned into a steady, haunting red glow. I had saved my wingman, but I was out of sky and out of time. The engines flamed out with a hollow, gut-wrenching cough. One moment, I was the apex predator of the skies, and the next, I was sitting in a $40 million glider. The sudden silence was terrifying. The only sound was the rush of wind over the canopy and the frantic beating of my own heart. I looked out one last time at the rescue helos hoisting Miller's basket. He was safe, but I was falling. I reached for the ejection handle between my legs, tucked my elbows in, and pulled. The world exploded into a chaotic blur of heat and noise as the seat rocketed me away from the dying jet. I felt the snap of the parachute, the sudden jerk of gravity, and then I was drifting, a lone man suspended between a sky that tried to kill me and a sea that wanted to swallow me whole. The water hit me like a brick wall. The weight of my gear dragged me deep into the cold dark before my life vest inflated, popping me back to the surface. As I bobbed in the swells, I watched my aircraft disappear beneath the waves, taking its secrets to the floor of the Gulf. Minutes later, the downdraft of a Black Hawk whipped the water into a frenzy above me. A diver jumped in, his hand gripping my flight suit, pulling me toward the light. As we were winched up, I looked toward the Iranian coast. The missiles were cold, the boats were gone, and the world was none the wiser that we had been seconds away from a total catastrophe. We had survived the encounter, but as the door of the helo slid shut, I knew that the story of what really happened out there, the missing pilot, the ghost on the radio, and the narrow miss of a global war would stay buried in the depths, known only to those of us who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. Back on the deck of the carrier, the silence was even louder than the roar of the engines. There were no medals waiting for us, no press conferences, and no official reports detailing the standoff. Miller and I stood on the steel plating, soaked in salt water and shivering from the adrenaline crash, while a high-ranking officer pulled us into a windowless room. He didn't ask if we were okay. He asked if we understood that this mission never happened. The logs were being wiped, the radar tracks deleted, and the missing pilot was officially recorded as a mechanical training incident. We were the ghosts of a war that didn't start, living evidence of a tension that the world wasn't ready to handle. I still wake up some nights hearing that high-pitched scream of the radar lock or the distorted voice on the radio claiming Miller as a guest. Every time I look at the map of the Persian Gulf, I don't see blue water. I see the place where I almost traded my life and my country's peace for the man flying on my wing. We got out, but the incident left a permanent scar on the way we view the horizon. The world thinks it knows the history of the Middle East, but the most terrifying stories aren't in the history books. They're held in the memories of pilots who had to choose between their orders and their souls. And as I watched the sunset over the flight deck that evening, I realized that some secrets are kept not to protect the mission, but to protect the world from the truth of how close we are to the edge. Years later, the official records still show a blank space where that afternoon should be. Miller moved on, eventually leaving the service to find a quiet life far from the ocean, but we never talk about that day. We don't have to. The bond between us isn't built on the missions we completed, but on the one we survived in total darkness. Sometimes I see a news report about rising tensions or a minor skirmish in the Gulf, and I can feel the phantom weight of the ejection handle in my palm. The public sees a headline. I see the faces of young men caught in the crosshairs of empires. I'm retired now, but I still catch myself looking at the horizon whenever I'm near the coast. I know what's out there. I know how thin the line is between a normal Tuesday and a global catastrophe. They say the truth sets you free, but in the world of high-stakes shadows, the truth is just something you carry until it becomes part of you. My jet is still down there, resting in the silt of the Persian Gulf, a silent monument to a war that never was. And as for me, I'm just grateful that I'm here to tell the story, even if, officially, I was never there at all. The incident remains a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the halls of the Pentagon that never reached the evening news. People often ask me if I regret ignoring those orders, if I ever wonder what my life would look like if I had just turned my jet around and headed back to the carrier. I tell them the same thing every time. I didn't join the Navy to follow a map. I joined to protect the man flying beside me. In the cockpit, you don't fight for a flag or a policy. You fight for a heartbeat. As I sit here today, the sky above me is clear and the air is still. But I know that somewhere out there right now, another young pilot is staring at a radar screen, feeling that same jagged electricity in the air, and preparing to make a choice that could change the world. We like to think we are in control of history, but the truth is, history is made in those split seconds of courage and defiance that the cameras never capture. My story didn't shock the world because the world was never allowed to see it. But for Miller and me, it was the only story that ever mattered. We lived, we lost a piece of ourselves to the sea, and we kept the peace, one heartbeat at a time. In the end, that's the reality of the missing pilot story. It wasn't just about a man lost at sea or a jet lost to the depths. It was about the silent weight of a secret that could have leveled cities. Every time I see a headline about international incidents or technical glitches in the Persian Gulf, I don't see the politics. I see a cockpit, a lock-on tone, and a man bobbing in an orange life raft, waiting to see if his country or his wingman will show up before the enemy does. We walked away that day, but we left our peace of mind behind in those waters. If there's one thing this ordeal taught me, it's that the most important parts of history are the ones you'll never find on a Wikipedia page. They are the stories told in hushed tones over a drink, between two people who know exactly what it feels like to be abandoned by their command and saved by a brother. The world didn't change because of what happened to us, and maybe that's the biggest victory of all. We kept the fire from spreading, and sometimes being the hero means making sure no one ever knows your name. The final chapter of that day wasn't written in a report, but in the way I look at my own children today. When I see them playing in a world that feels safe and certain, I realize that the silence we were sworn to uphold was the greatest gift we could give. We took the trauma of that afternoon and buried it deep so that millions of people could go to sleep without ever knowing how close they came to waking up in a different world. It's a heavy burden to carry a secret that large, but it's a price I'd pay 1,000 times over. As the sun sets on my career and the memories begin to fade into the gray of age, I find peace in the quiet. Miller calls me once a year on the anniversary of the crash. We don't talk about the boats, the missiles, or the flame out. We just talk about life. But before we hang up, there's always that brief, loaded pause, a moment where we both remember the sound of the wind, the salt on our skin, and the miracle of being alive. The world may never know the story of the pilot who went missing in the shadow of Iran, but the sky remembers. And for me, that's more than enough. The legacy of that mission isn't found in a trophy case or a commendation letter. It's found in the quiet moments of a normal life that almost didn't happen. I think about the Iranian pilots and the sailors on those boats sometimes. They were just men following their own orders, caught in the same high-stakes game of chess as I was. We all stared into the same sun that day, separated by a few miles of water and a lifetime of ideology, yet connected by the shared realization that one wrong move would be the end of everything. I'm content being a footnote in a file that doesn't exist. There is a certain kind of honor in a mission that ends with a handshake instead of a headline. As I watch the planes fly overhead now, tracing white lines across a peaceful sky, I say a silent prayer for the ones currently in the seat, the ones holding the line in the dark corners of the globe where the cameras don't go. They are the guardians of a peace that is far more fragile than anyone realizes. My flight is over, the engines are cold, and the story is finally told. Not for the history books, but for the soul of every pilot who ever chose his brother over his badge. Over and out. It's been years since that day, but I've come to realize that the most powerful stories aren't the ones that make the front page. They're the ones that prevent the world from burning. We live in a time where everyone wants to be seen, where every moment is captured and uploaded for likes and views. But out there, over the dark waters of the Gulf, I learned the value of the invisible. I learned that true service often means being the ghost in the machine, the man who stands in the gap and then disappears back into the shadows once the threat is gone. The ocean has a way of reclaiming everything. It took my jet, it took my innocence, and it took the version of me that believed the world was a simple place of right and wrong. But in exchange, it gave me a perspective that few people ever get to have. I look at the people around me, the people in the grocery store, the families in the park, and I see a peace that I helped protect. They don't know my name, they don't know Miller's name, and they don't know how close we came to the edge. And honestly, that's exactly the way it should be. The mission was a success because the world never had to react to it. We did our job, we brought our brother home, and we let the world keep spinning. That's enough for me. Looking back, I realized that the true shock of the missing pilot story wasn't the attack itself, or even the technical failure of my aircraft. It was the realization of how easily a human life can become a pawn in a game of global chicken. For those few hours, Miller wasn't a person to the men on those boats or the commanders in the bunkers. He was a bargaining chip, a potential headline, a tool for leverage. It was only in the cockpit of my Hornet that he remained a friend, a father, and a soul worth saving. The world looks for the wreckage, but they're searching for the wrong thing. They want the medal, the black box, the smoking gun. But the real missing pilot story isn't under the waves. It's in the eyes of every veteran who carries a secret they were never supposed to survive. We didn't just escape a missile that day. We escaped a destiny that would have turned us into the first casualties of a third world war. As I stand here now, looking at the calm horizon, I realize that the most shocking part isn't that I was almost lost. It's that I was found by a brother who broke every rule to save me, and by a country that chose to erase me to save itself. My name isn't on a monument, and my jet will never be recovered. To the history books, I am a ghost. To the military, I am a clerical error. But to the man who pulled me from that raft, and to the world that keeps on spinning without knowing how close it came to the edge, I am the truth that no headline could ever capture. The mission is over. The engines are silent. The secret is safe. My name is gone, but I am finally home. This is the end of the story the world was never meant to hear. Over and out.